Hey guys, tonight we begin with something oddly comforting, and just a little bit gross. If you think about it too much, so maybe don't think about it too much. Just settle in, dim the lights a bit, get cozy, maybe grab a blanket, and, ideally, not a snack that's been sitting out since last Thursday. Because tonight, we're talking about people who absolutely would eat that snack. Yes, tonight's slow, drifting journey through history, all about eating rotten and stale food, not as a mistake, not as a last resort, but sometimes as a preference, or a necessity, or, in certain cases, a personality trait. And as always, we're not rushing anywhere. We'll just float from one questionable meal to another, meeting kings, nobles, and unfortunate peasants who all had one thing in common. Their food choices would make a modern fridge cry quietly in the corner. So, take a slow breath, and let's begin. Let's start in medieval Europe, a time when refrigeration did not exist. Hygiene was more of a suggestion, and food safety standards were, well, non-existent. Now, you might assume that people back then were just constantly eating fresh, farm-to-table meals. Rustic bread, fresh milk, maybe a nice roast. And sometimes, yes, that's happened. But more often, food had a timeline. And that timeline was a flexible. Bread, for instance, was not always eaten fresh. In fact, most bread became stale fairly quickly. And instead of throwing it away because wasting food was not exactly fashionable, when famine was always lurking nearby, they simply kept eating it. Very hard bread became something called trenchers. These were basically edible plates, or, depending on how long they'd been sitting around, semi-edible plates. You'd place your meat or stew on top of this slab of old bread. The juices would soak in, the bread would soften slightly, and then, after the meal, you might eat it, or you might not. Sometimes the trenchers were so tough, so soaked, and so questionable that they were given to the poor, or to animals, which is a polite historical way of saying, here, you deal with it. And already, we're off to a strong start. Now, let's gently drift toward meat. Meat, as you can imagine, did not stay fresh for long, especially in a world without refrigeration, so people got creative. Salting was common, drying was common, smoking was common, but even with all of that, meat still had a habit of going bad, and when it did, well, people didn't always throw it away. Instead, they developed a fascinating relationship with spices. Spices were expensive, like, extremely expensive, like, this costs more than your house expensive, and yet, the wealthy used them generously. Why? Partly for flavor, but also to mask the taste of meat that was starting to turn. So if you've ever wondered why medieval recipes sometimes read like someone dropped an entire spice cabinet into a stew, that might be your answer. It wasn't just about making food taste good, it was about making food taste not alarming. Let's pause here for a moment, because this is where things get quietly ironic. The richest people, the kings, the nobles, the elite, had access to the most food, the best food, the most exotic ingredients, and yet, they were also the ones most likely to eat heavily spiced, slightly questionable meat, because of course they were. Meanwhile, poorer people often relied on simpler diets: grains, vegetables, maybe a bit of dairy. Not always exciting, not always sufficient, but sometimes less likely to involve elaborate attempts to disguise decay. History has a sense of humor like that. Now let's gently float over to a specific example. A king, naturally, because kings are excellent at turning everyday habits into something slightly absurd. Consider King Henry VIII of England. A man known for many things, none of them subtle. Henry had a large court, a very large appetite, and access to enormous quantities of food. Now, food at court was prepared in huge batches. Massive kitchens, dozens of cooks, endless dishes. But here's the thing, once food was prepared, it didn't always get eaten immediately. Dishes might sit out. Banquets could stretch for hours. And leftovers, well, they didn't necessarily go to waste. Food could be reheated, reserved, reimagined, possibly re-questioned. And while Henry himself likely got the best of what was available, the system around him was not exactly built for freshness. So even in a royal palace, surrounded by luxury, there was a quiet, ever-present possibility that what you were eating had seen better days. But you wouldn't say anything, because, you know, it's the king. Now, let's take a softer turn and drift toward dairy, milk, cheese, butter, all delightful, all perishable. Without refrigeration, milk spoiled quickly, very quickly. So people often turned it into cheese, which lasts longer, much longer. But even cheese has its limits. And yet, aged cheese became a delicacy. The smellier, the stronger, the more intense, the better, which is fine, up to a point. But there are historical accounts of cheeses that were, let's say, active, as in, containing live larvae. Yes, maggots. Now, before you recoil too dramatically, this was not always considered a problem. In fact, in some places, it was considered a feature, the logic being, if something is alive, it hasn't gone completely bad, which is a perspective, and one that we will not question too loudly. Because we are trying to stay calm and sleepy, let's gently move onward to fermented foods, because if something is going to rot, you might as well guide the process. Fermentation was, and still is, a way to preserve food. It creates strong flavors, it extends shelf life, and sometimes it produces things that are technically safe to eat, but emotionally challenging. Take fish, for example. In parts of Northern Europe, fish was fermented until it developed a very strong odor, an odor that modern descriptions often struggle to describe politely, and yet it was eaten, appreciated, even enjoyed, because when fresh food is scarce, your standards adjust, and over time, your tastes follow. Now, let's pause again and notice something quietly fascinating. Humans are incredibly adaptable. Give us fresh food, and we'll enjoy it. Give us stale food, and we'll find a way to make it acceptable. Give us rotten food, and, with enough time, cultural context, and perhaps a bit of salt, we might even call it a delicacy. It's not about preference, exactly. It's about survival, habit, and sometimes tradition. Let's drift now to a colder place, somewhere like Scandinavia. Long winters, limited fresh food, lots of preservation. Here, people developed methods like drying, fermenting, and storing food for months, sometimes longer. And occasionally, things didn't go perfectly. Fish might become overly fermented, meat might dry unevenly, storage conditions might fluctuate. But throwing food away was not an option, so you ate it, carefully, slowly, with a certain level of acceptance, and perhaps a strong drink nearby. Now, let's bring in another royal figure, because they do add a certain flavor to these stories. Consider Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, a man of immense power, elaborate routines, and surprisingly delicate digestion. Louis had very particular eating habits. Meals were structured, ceremonial, observed. But despite all the grandeur, food safety was still not exactly modern. Dishes could sit out during long ceremonies. Ingredients were not always fresh by today's standards. And the sheer scale of royal dining meant that not everything was perfectly managed. And Louis, like many nobles, suffered from frequent digestive issues, which, in hindsight, is not entirely surprising. But at the time, it was just part of life, a slightly uncomfortable, ongoing part of life. And as we slowly come to the end of this first part, let's reflect on something simple. Eating rotten or stale food wasn't always a mistake. Sometimes it was necessity. Sometimes it was tradition. Sometimes it was just how things were done. And in a world without refrigeration, without modern hygiene, without expiration dates, the line between fresh and not fresh was a little blurry, and people lived in that blur every single day, calmly, casually, occasionally with a bit of spice. So, as you settle in a little deeper, maybe shifting your pillow, or letting your eyes rest for a moment, in the next part, we'll continue drifting through history. We'll meet more individuals, some royal, some not, who had their own quiet relationships with food that had lingered a bit too long. We'll explore strange delicacies, questionable habits, and the soft, persistent reality of eating whatever was available, because history, like leftovers, has a way of sticking around. All right, welcome back. If you're still awake, that's perfectly fine. If you're not, then we're doing exactly what we're supposed to be doing. Either way, just settle a little deeper, maybe adjust your blanket, and let's continue a slow drift through history, where the food is still not entirely reassuring. In the last part, we spent some time with stale bread, overly ambitious spices, and cheeses that had a life of their own. And tonight, we're not improving the situation, not even slightly. Instead, we're going to wander gently into the world of banquets. Those grand, glittering displays of wealth and power, where the food looked impressive, smelled intense, and sometimes had been sitting around far longer than anyone would admit. Now, medieval and early modern banquets were not quick affairs. They were long, very long. Hours would pass, dishes would arrive in waves. Guests would talk, watch performances, admire each other's clothing, and occasionally eat. But here's the quiet detail that often gets overlooked. Food didn't always arrive fresh from the kitchen straight to your plate. There was a process, a slow one. Dishes might be prepared well in advance, then arranged, then carried through large halls, then presented, then admired, and only after all that, eaten, which means that by the time a piece of roasted meat reached your plate, it had already spent a fair amount of time existing, at room temperature, surrounded by other people, and no one said a word, because again, it's a banquet. You're not here to complain. You're here to nod politely and take a bite. Let's gently zoom in on one such setting. A noble household in late medieval Europe. Picture a long wooden table, candles flickering, servants moving carefully through the room. A large roasted bird is brought out. It looks magnificent, golden skin, carefully arranged feathers, sometimes reattached for decoration. Because why not make things a little confusing? And it's placed at the center of the table. Now, here's the thing. That bird may have been cooked hours ago. It may have cooled and then been reheated, or not reheated, or partially reheated, or simply trusted to be fine. And everyone around the table proceeds as if this is completely normal. Because it is. Let's drift slightly to the side, toward leftovers. Modern life has taught us to be very cautious about leftovers. Refrigerate quickly, reheat thoroughly, don't leave things out too long. Medieval life had a different approach. Leftovers were a resource. Food from one meal could appear again in another, and not just once. A roasted joint of meat might be served fresh, then later sliced into a stew. then later incorporated into a pie, and possibly, later still, appear in some form that no longer resembled its original self. It's a kind of culinary reincarnation, and each stage carried a little bit more history with it, sometimes quite a lot of history. Now, let's take a slow, slightly uncomfortable step into the world of pies, because medieval pies were not always what we think of today. Yes, they had crusts, but those crusts were often very thick, hard, more like containers than something you'd actually eat. Inside, you could find a mixture of meats, spices, and whatever needed to be used up, and that mixture could include ingredients that had already been around for a while. The spices would help, the cooking would help, but the overall effect was less about freshness and more about transformation. You take something that's starting to go off, you combine it with other things that are also not at their peak. You cook it thoroughly, and you present it as a new dish, and technically, it works. Let's float now toward a slightly more specific figure. Someone who embodies the quiet excess of court life. Consider Charles II of Spain. Now, Charles II is often remembered for many things, most of them not particularly flattering. His health was fragile. His appearance was distinctive, and his lineage was extremely intertwined, let's say. But beyond all that, he lived in a court system that was deeply ceremonial. Meals were formal, structured, observed, and like many royal courts, the Spanish court operated on scale. Large kitchens, complex preparation, multiple courses. But again, scale does not guarantee freshness. Food could sit, it could wait, it could be handled by many people before reaching its final destination, and Charles himself, with his delicate constitution, often struggled with food. Digestion was not his strong point, which, given everything we've discussed so far, feels almost inevitable. Let's gently step away from royalty for a moment and drift into monasteries. Now, monasteries are often imagined as places of simplicity, quiet living, modest meals, and that's mostly true. But simplicity does not necessarily mean freshness. Monks relied heavily on preserved foods, bread, cheese, dried fish, fermented vegetables. Meals were regular, predictable, and sometimes repetitive. And when food supplies ran low, or storage conditions weren't ideal, things could become less than perfect. But waste was discouraged strongly. So if something was still technically edible, it was eaten quietly, without complaint, because complaining about slightly spoiled food was not exactly in line with a life of humility. Now, let's wander gently into a slightly stranger corner of history, the idea of intentional aging, because sometimes food wasn't just allowed to go stale, it was encouraged. Take game meat, for example. In certain periods, especially in aristocratic circles, there was a preference for meat that had been hung for a while, which is a polite way of saying left to age, and by age we mean begin the early stages of decomposition, just slightly, enough to change the flavor, to make it more intense, more interesting. And while this might sound alarming, it was considered refined, sophisticated, a mark of good taste, which is one of those moments where history gently reminds us that taste is very relative. Let's pause here again and notice the pattern. Freshness, in the modern sense, was not always the goal. Flavor, preservation, practicality, these were often more important, and sometimes Those priorities led to food that was a little past its prime, but still valued. Now, let's slowly make our way to another royal table. This time in France again, but a bit later, we'll bring in Marie Antoinette. Now, Marie Antoinette is often associated with luxury, indulgence, and famously, misunderstandings about bread. But her daily life at court was highly structured. Meals were public events, observed by courtiers, full of ritual. Unlike all court meals, they involved preparation, presentation, and time. Lots of time. Food could sit out while people watched, while etiquette was followed, while everything unfolded according to tradition. And again, by the time it was actually eaten, it had been around. But no one was there for the food, really. They were there for the spectacle. The food was almost secondary. Almost. Now, let's drift towards something quieter, something almost relatable. Imagine being a servant in one of these large households. You don't eat at the main table, you eat later. After the nobles have finished, and what do you eat? Leftovers, food that has already been served, already handled, already experienced, and you eat it because it's what's available, and because it's still better than nothing. And over time, this becomes normal, comfortable, even, because it's consistent. And as we slowly come to the end of part 2, everything begins to feel a little familiar. Food that lingers, meals that stretch, ingredients that are reused, repurposed, reimagined. A world where freshness is not guaranteed, but life goes on anyway, calmly, steadily, with a quiet acceptance that things are not always perfect and don't need to be. So, as you settle a little deeper into your pillow, maybe letting your thoughts drift just slightly, in the next part, we'll continue this slow journey. We'll explore more unusual food habits, more historical figures, and more gentle examples of how people adapted to a world where food had a longer story to tell. Gentle examples of how people adapted to a world where food had a longer story to tell. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very simple, very quiet, and honestly, a little humbling. So go ahead, dim the lights, settle into your bed. Maybe pull the blanket just a bit higher, and let everything slow down. Because tonight, we're not in palaces, not yet, no golden plates, no overspiced royal feasts trying to hide questionable meat. Instead, we're going somewhere much quieter. We're stepping into small homes, narrow streets, cold mornings, and long days where food isn't about taste. It's about getting through one more day. Tonight, we're talking about poor people's survival meals, and as always, we're in no rush at all. Let's begin somewhere in medieval Europe, in a village that looks almost the same as the next one, and the next one, and the next one. A few wooden houses, dirt paths, maybe a small field nearby. Smoke rising slowly from low chimneys. Inside one of these houses, a pot sits over a fire, and in that pot is something called pottage. Now, pottage is not exciting. It's not meant to be. It's a mixture, a slow, ongoing mixture. Whatever is available goes into the pot. Grains, maybe barley, maybe oats, a few vegetables, if they're in season. Cabbage, onions, turnips, the reliable ones. The ones that survive harsh conditions, and occasionally, if luck is feeling generous, a small piece of meat. but not often. Mostly, it's vegetables and grains, cooked slowly, stirred occasionally, left to sit, reheated, added to again, day after day, the same pot, continuing its quiet existence. You don't empty it completely, you just keep adding to it, which means, technically, parts of that meal might be several days old, or longer, but it's warm, it's filling, and it keeps you going, and that's enough. Now, let's sit with that for a moment. There's something strangely calming about it, not the hunger, of course, not the limitation, but the routine, the predictability. You wake up, you work, you eat from the same pot, you sleep, and tomorrow, you do it again. No surprises, no variety, just steady continuation. Let's gently move a little closer into the life of a specific kind of person, a peasant farmer. We won't give him a name. There are too many of them. And their lives are quietly similar. He wakes up early, before the sun fully rises. There's work to do. Fields don't care if you're tired. And breakfast, if it exists at all, is simple. A piece of bread, dark, heavy bread, made from whatever grain was available. Sometimes mixed with things that aren't technically grain, peas, beans, even ground acorns, in difficult times, because why not stretch it a little further? The bread is dense, slightly sour, possibly a bit stale, but it's food, and he eats it slowly, without thinking too much about it, because thinking about it doesn't make it better. Let's float gently to another corner. A city this time. Medieval cities were crowded, busy, a little chaotic, and for the poor, food was even more uncertain here. You might not have a pot constantly simmering. You might rely on what you can buy or find. Street food existed, simple things, bread, mostly. Maybe a bit of cheese, occasionally something fried, but even here, quality was inconsistent. Bread might be stretched with fillers. Bakers sometimes added things like chalk, ground bones to make flour go further, which sounds impressive in a very concerning way. And people knew this, but options were limited, so you bought the bread, and you ate it, and you moved on. Now, let's drift slowly towards something a bit more specific, and quietly heartbreaking. Famine food. Because sometimes, even pottage wasn't enough. Sometimes, crops failed. And when that happened, people turned to things they wouldn't normally consider food. Grass, tree bark, roots that weren't usually eaten. Anything that could be boiled, softened, and swallowed. And again, this wasn't about taste, it was about survival. And over time, these desperate choices became familiar, not preferred, never preferred, but known. Let's pause just for a moment, because there's a quiet contrast forming here. Earlier, we talked about kings eating slightly spoiled meat with expensive spices. Now, we're here, where food is stretched to its absolute limit, where freshness is a luxury, where variety is rare, and yet, both worlds exist at the same time, not far from each other. History is like that. Let's gently move now to another figure, someone a little more visible. Consider Richard II of England. Now, Richard himself lived in luxury, lavish meals, elaborate court life, but during his reign, many of his people did not. There were periods of economic difficulty, social unrest, food shortages, and while Richard focused on courtly elegance, poetry, and refined living, Large parts of the population were quietly struggling to eat. It's one of those subtle historical contrasts. A king enjoying carefully prepared dishes, while just beyond the palace walls, people are boiling whatever they can find. Not dramatic, not loud, just quietly happening. Let's float back to the countryside. It's evening now. The day's work is done, and our unnamed farmer returns home. The pot is still there, still warm, still waiting. He sits down, maybe with family, maybe alone, and he eats, slowly, without conversation, sometimes, because there's not much to say. The food is the same as yesterday, and probably the same as tomorrow, but it fills the space. It marks the end of the day, and that's enough. Now, let's drift slightly sideways into another kind of survival meal. Gruel. Thin, watery, almost more drink than food. Made from oats or barley, boiled in water, sometimes with a bit of salt. That's it. No spices, no richness, no variety, just warmth and a little bit of sustenance. And yet, for many people, this was a daily reality. Morning, evening, the same simple bowl, over and over. Let's gently introduce another figure. Not a king this time, but someone who noticed these conditions. Thomas More. Now, Thomas More wrote about society, about fairness, about how things could be different, and while he lived a relatively comfortable life, he was aware of the inequalities around him. He saw the contrast, the excess at the top, and the simplicity, sometimes the desperation, at the bottom. And in his writings, he imagined a world where resources were shared more evenly, where people didn't have to rely on survival meals just to get by. It was a nice idea, a calm, thoughtful idea, and like many nice ideas in history, it stayed mostly on paper. Let's slowly return to our quiet rhythm. A pot, a fire, a simple meal, day after day. There's something almost timeless about it. Even as centuries pass, the basic experience doesn't change much. People wake up, they work, they eat what they have, and they keep going. Now, as we gently approach the end of part 1, everything begins to soften a little. The details blur together. Pottage, bread, gruel. Simple foods, repeated endlessly. Not exciting, not varied, but steady, reliable, in their own way, and deeply tied to survival. So, as you relax a little more, maybe your eyes getting heavier, your thoughts slowing down, in the next part, we'll continue this quiet journey. We'll meet more people, drift through more places, and explore the small, everyday meals that kept ordinary lives moving forward. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something soft, slow, and just slightly undercooked. So go ahead, dim the lights. Put your phone a little further away, maybe stretch out your legs, and let your breathing settle into something calm and even, because tonight we're stepping into kitchens that were busy, loud, important, and yet not always very good at actually cooking things properly. Not terrible on purpose, just inconsistent. Tonight, we're talking about the lack of proper cooking in history, and as always, we're in no rush at all. Let's begin in a place that sounds impressive, a royal kitchen. Now, when you hear royal kitchen, you probably imagine perfection. Skilled chefs, perfect timing, everything cooked just right, and sometimes that was true, but more often it was chaos. Large kitchens in medieval and early modern courts were enormous operations. Dozens of cooks, fires burning constantly, Meat roasting, boiling, frying, all at the same time. And here's the quiet problem. There were no precise temperatures, no timers, no thermometers, just experience, guesswork, and a lot of pressure. So sometimes things were overcooked, and sometimes they were not cooked enough. Let's pause there for a moment, because undercooking is a subtle issue. It doesn't announce itself loudly, it just sits there. A piece of meat that looks done, smells fine, but inside is still a little too close to its original state. And in a busy royal kitchen, with dozens of dishes being prepared at once, this happened more often than anyone would admit. But again, no one complains, because it's the king's table, and you're not about to say, "Excuse me, this is slightly raw." That would be socially complicated. Let's gently bring in a figure who knew a thing or two about royal excess. Consider Henry IV of France. Now, Henry IV was known for his relatively down-to-earth personality. A king who preferred simple food over overly elaborate dishes, which sounds refreshing, but even with simpler tastes, he still relied on royal kitchens. And royal kitchens, as we've just seen, were not always consistent. Food could arrive undercooked, or unevenly cooked, or cooked in a hurry. And Henry, being practical, often just ate it anyway, because at the end of the day, food is food, and kings, despite everything, still get hungry. Let's drift slightly away from royalty into a more ordinary setting. A village home, a single fire, a pot hanging above it. Now, cooking here is simpler, but also less controlled. The fire might be too hot or too weak, the pot might not heat evenly, and the person cooking is doing their best with limited tools, so meals can be inconsistent. One day, the stew is perfectly cooked. The next day, the vegetables are still a bit hard. The grain's a bit underdone, but you eat it anyway, because waiting longer means using more fuel, and fuel is not always easy to come by. Now, let's gently move into something a bit more specific. Bread. Bread is simple, right? Flour, water, maybe yeast, bake it, done. Except, not always. Medieval ovens were large, wood-fired, and very difficult to regulate. The heat could vary wildly. Some parts of the oven might be extremely hot, others much cooler. So when you bake bread, you get variety. Some loaves are perfectly baked, others are slightly burnt on the outside, and still doughy inside. And again, nothing is wasted. So you eat it. You chew through the slightly raw center, and you move on, because that's just how it is. Let's float now into a slightly more refined setting again, because refinement does not always mean improvement. Consider Louis XV. Louis XV lived in a world of elegance, fine dining, carefully prepared meals, but even in the grand kitchens of Versailles, consistency was not guaranteed. Dishes were complex, recipes were elaborate. Timing was everything, and when you're preparing dozens of dishes for a large court, things slip. A roast might be taken out too early. A sauce might not fully come together. A dish might look perfect, but not quite be finished. And yet, it is served, because presentation matters. Appearance matters, and once it's on the table, it's staying there. Let's pause again and notice something gently ironic. The more complex the cooking becomes, the more chances there are for things to go slightly wrong. Simple meals might be basic, but they're predictable. Complex meals carry risk, and history is full of small, quiet examples of that risk playing out. Now, let's drift towards something a bit more unusual. boiling. Boiling was one of the most common cooking methods. It's reliable. It softens food. It makes things easier to digest. But even boiling has its issues. If you don't boil something long enough, it remains tough, hard to chew, hard to digest, and in some cases, not entirely safe. But again, time and fuel are limited, so people make choices. They boil just enough, and then they stop, and the result is something that's technically cooked, but not fully, and that becomes normal. Let's gently bring in another figure. Someone who had a complicated relationship with food and health. Consider Charles VI of France. Now, Charles VI is known for his mental instability, his unpredictable behavior, and his long periods of confusion. But alongside all that, his daily life continued. Meals were prepared, food was served, and in a court already dealing with inconsistency, his condition added another layer. He might refuse food, or eat irregularly, or react strangely to meals, and the food itself, prepared in large kitchens, was not always perfect. So you have a king already struggling, eating meals that are sometimes undercooked, sometimes overcooked, sometimes just there, and everything continues quietly. Let's move now into something almost comforting again, routine mistakes, because one of the most human things in history is doing something slightly wrong, and then just continuing. A cook prepares a dish. It's not quite right, but it's close enough, so it's served, and people eat it, and no one makes a big deal. Because perfection is not the goal. Survival, continuation, routine, those are the goals. Now, let's drift slowly into the evening again. A small home, a simple fire, a pot of something that's been cooking, maybe not quite long enough, but the day's ending. People are tired, and waiting longer doesn't feel worth it, so the food is served, slightly underdone, but warm and filling, and that's enough. Let's gently introduce one more figure before we close this part. James I of England. James I had many quirks. He was intelligent, talkative, and not particularly known for elegance. His court, like many others, relied on large kitchens, and like many others, those kitchens were imperfect. Meals could be inconsistent. Cooking could vary, and James, with his many interests and distractions, was not always focused on the details of what he was eating, which, in a way, made things simpler. You eat what's in front of you, and you move on. And now, as we slowly come to the end of part 1, everything settles into a quiet rhythm. Fires that burn unevenly, ovens that heat unpredictably, cooks doing their best with limited tools and limited time, meals that are not quite perfect, sometimes undercooked, sometimes just acceptable, and a world that continues anyway, without complaint, without pause. So, as your thoughts begin to soften, and your body relaxes just a little more, in the next part, we'll continue this slow journey. We'll explore more kitchens, more meals, and more people quietly navigating a world where cooking was more art than science, and not always successful. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very quiet, very slow, and just a little bit heavy, but in a calm, drifting kind of way. So go ahead, dim the lights, maybe turn onto your side, let your shoulders relax, and just settle in, because tonight, we're not talking about feasts, or banquets, or over-the-top royal meals. We're talking about the opposite. Tonight, we're stepping into a world of food shortages, a world where meals become smaller, simpler, and sometimes disappear altogether. And as always, we'll take it slow. Let's begin in a place that feels familiar by now. A small village, a few fields, a handful of houses, a quiet rhythm of life that depends entirely on the land. And for a while, things are fine. Crops grow, harvest comes, food is stored. But then, something shifts. Maybe the weather changes. Too much rain, or not enough. Maybe a cold season arrives too early. Maybe pests move in, and slowly, almost gently, the harvest becomes smaller. Not gone, not yet, just less. At first, people adjust. Meals become slightly smaller. The pot still simmers, but there's less inside it. A few fewer vegetables, a bit more water. No one says much, because everyone notices. Now, let's sit with that moment. It's not dramatic. No one panics immediately. It's just a quiet awareness that things are not quite right. And that awareness lingers. Let's gently bring in a wider perspective. Consider Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Now, this wasn't just one village, or one bad harvest. This was years of poor weather, heavy rains, failed crops, across much of Europe. And slowly, steadily, food shortages became a shared experience. Not loud, not sudden, just persistent. People tried to adapt. They planted again and again. They stretched what they had. Grain supplies were rationed. Bread became smaller, thinner, sometimes mixed with whatever could extend it. Because why not double down on survival? Let's drift into one household during this time. A family sits around a table. There's bread, but not much. The loaf is cut carefully, precisely. Everyone gets a piece. No one asks for more, because there isn't any. Now, let's move gently toward another figure, someone who existed above all this, and yet not entirely separate from it. Consider Edward II of England. Now, Edward II lived in a world of castles and court politics, a world that, on the surface, seemed insulated from famine. But even kings are connected to their land. When crops fail, revenues drop, supplies become harder to manage. Food still reaches the court. Of course it does. But the system around it begins to strain. And Edward himself, not exactly known for strong leadership, struggled to respond effectively, which, in a quiet, understated way, made things worse. Let's pause again, because this is where history becomes gently ironic. At the top, there is still food, not always abundant, not always perfect, but present. At the bottom, things are thinning out, slowly, quietly, and the distance between those two realities becomes more noticeable. Let's drift now into another type of shortage, urban shortages. Cities rely on supply. Food has to come in from outside, and when harvests fail, that supply becomes uncertain. Prices rise, markets grow quieter, bread becomes expensive, and for the poor, inaccessible. Imagine walking through a market. Stalls are still there, but they're less full, fewer vegetables, less grain, and what is there costs more. You look, you hesitate, and sometimes you walk away. Let's gently introduce another figure, someone known for thinking deeply about society, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Rousseau lived later, but he wrote about inequality, about how society distributes resources, and while he didn't live through the Great Famine, the patterns he observed were shaped by these long-standing realities. Food shortages don't affect everyone equally. Some adjust, some struggle, some go without. And Rousseau, in his calm, reflective way, pointed out that imbalance, not loudly, just thoughtfully. Let's return to our village. Time has passed. The shortage hasn't disappeared. Meals are now noticeably smaller. The pot still exists, but it's thinner, lighter, more water than substance. People begin to rely on stored food, grain from previous harvests. But those stores are not endless, and as they shrink, the sense of quiet concern grows. Still not panic, just awareness. Now, let's float gently toward another royal figure. Consider Louis XVI. Louis XVI is often remembered in connection with food shortages, especially bread. During his reign, France experienced economic strain. Poor harvests, rising food prices, and bread, the most basic staple, became harder to afford. Now, Louis himself lived comfortably. His table was not empty, but the people around him, many of them, were feeling the pressure. And while he wasn't entirely unaware, his responses were slow, measured, sometimes hesitant, and history, in its quiet way, noticed. Let's pause again, because food shortages are rarely about one moment. They're about accumulation, small changes, building over time. A little less food, a little higher price, a little more worrying, and eventually, those small things become something larger. Let's drift now into a different kind of environment. A monastery. Food here is simple, but structured. Rations are measured. Meals are regular. But even here, shortages are felt. Portions become smaller. Ingredients become limited. And the quiet routine continues with slightly less. Let's gently move into another household. This time, in a city. A worker returns home. There's no pot simmering all day. Food has to be bought. And today, there's not enough money. So the meal is minimal. Bread, maybe, or nothing. And the evening passes, quietly. Now, let's introduce one more figure before we close this part. Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette is often associated with the phrase about cake. Though history has complicated that story, but what matters here is the contrast. While many people struggled with rising food prices, she lived in a world of abundance, not intentionally cruel, just distant, removed from the daily experience of shortage, and that distance became part of her story. Let's slowly return to our quiet rhythm. A village, a city, a court, different worlds, different experiences, but all connected by the same underlying reality, food becoming less certain. As we gently come to the end of part 1, everything softens again. Emptying stores, smaller meals, quiet adjustments, no sudden drama, just a slow shift from enough to not quite enough. So, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift, in the next part, we'll continue this journey. We'll explore how people adapted, how they stretched what little they had, and how entire societies quietly adjusted to a world where food was no longer guaranteed.